Hi everyone, I'm Rita Kakati-Shah. I'm your host for the Uma Show. Welcome to your one-stop journey to feeling empowered. We're a platform for change. We build confidence. We are your voice. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma. Today, we're exploring movers and shakers in science. And I'm so excited to be joined by a goddess of go-getting, Shohini Ghose, who is a multi-award winning quantum physicist and professor of physics and computer science at Wilfrid Laurier University in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Shohini. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So tell us, you were born in India, where you dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Tell us about your upbringing and your love of space.
Yeah, I remember when I was a little girl, back in 1984, the first Indian astronaut went to space. That was Rakesh Sharma. So that was, I think, probably when it all clicked to me, because I felt like, oh, so things like I'd seen in Star Trek could be in real life too. And, you know, being from India, that's still something that's a gateway that could open up. So that was really opened my frontiers personally. And, you know, I was always somebody who loved mysteries and, you know, detective stories. And I liked to explore and sort of figure out problems and solve puzzles. And, you know, in school, eventually I realized, well, you know, the one thing that has the best puzzles is the universe. So I wanted to, you know, solve the mysteries of the universe, if you like. And that's kind of led me on the path to, you know, studying mathematics and physics. And I enjoyed it. And yeah, that's sort of my first steps in that journey forward.
I love that. It's amazing how as a young person, you can actually tell that, you know what, I love solving puzzles. And then you just look into the sky and you think, what is going on out there? I love that. You know, it's an amazing story. So then you actually moved to the States, where you did actually study physics and mathematics as an undergraduate. And then you received your PhD in physics from the University of New Mexico, where your thesis actually won the Chairman's Award for Best Dissertation. Tell us some more about your education and your pursuit of quantum physics.
Yeah, so my interest in physics generally became much more focused after, you know, my third or fourth year as an undergraduate student. I was in the general physics program, but then I had this great opportunity to work on a summer research project. So I highly recommend that to any students who are just now exploring their options, because it's a little different from just taking classes. Right. Because you get to explore a project and be almost like a pioneer, the explorer, because you don't know the answer to this question. That's what's great about research. There's no right answer like in a homework problem or so. It's up to you to discover something new. So this to me was very much like, you know, being on that Star Trek spaceship and exploring new worlds, except I was exploring it sitting in a lab and, you know, working through ideas and new territory that nobody else had actually ever, you know, found solutions to, because it would be a new problem. Now, of course, I didn't know everything that I was doing. I didn't really understand everything. These are the first steps, but I kind of jumped in. I'm like, oh, cool, because it's all new and I can pretend that I'm some cool explorer. And I loved that experience. And turns out the project was my first real taste of what would eventually lead to, you know, my focus in quantum physics. So the project, it was about exploring properties of atoms interacting with light. And that led me to choose that as my physics focus area for my PhD thesis. And also the area that I was looking into was a fairly new emerging field back, you know, about 10, 20 years ago, which is this new area called quantum computing, which now seems like everybody has heard about it. But back then it was not even a thing.
Yeah.
So that, of course, excited me, because I was all about, oh, cool, unexplored new things. Yeah. And I think that made me very committed to that particular field. And I felt like I've seen the whole entire field grow during my sort of, you know, time exploring it myself. And yeah, I was lucky enough to get in and on the ground, and that led to some really interesting new results that led to my thesis.
I love that. Amazing. And then actually with your studies, you actually moved to Canada, where you are now, and you're a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so while I was working on my PhD, it was not all fun and games because, of course, PhDs are hard and they take a lot of focus. But then the other major thing that happened, and it was not just something that affected me, it affected everybody, was that 9/11 happened. And, of course, as an international student on a student visa, that had major impact on how the policies around being able to, sort of continue in my career staying in the US. Of course, that changed, both from a career point of view as well as just, how things have changed a lot since then, as we all know. And that made me, rethink, questions that I had kind of ignored in my own physics career. As a student, I thought, okay, I just want to focus on physics because I love it and everything else is irrelevant. Of course, not true. And that was kind of a rude awakening, saying, no, many things matter. It matters who I am and where I belong and how how I fit into the world and how the world sees me. And so those kinds of questions led me to explore different options for where I wanted to go next with my career.
Yeah.
And I was lucky again to connect with a wonderful physicist based in Canada at the University of Calgary, who was very interested in the work I was doing, and that led me to go to Canada. And for a couple of years, I was a postdoc in Calgary. And right around that time was when this position opened up at Wilfrid Laurier University. But I didn't really feel ready at the time because I'm like, no, I don't have enough experience. I don't know what it means to be a professor. Oh my gosh, that seemed out of reach. And I remember my supervisor, very smart man, he said to me, just do it for practice. Apply, and if you get an interview, think of it as practice because you'll have to do it later anyway. So he kind of took away the pressure because I went in saying, oh yeah, this is just practice. So I was totally relaxed, and that really helped me. So yeah, a very good strategy in hindsight.
I love that.
Yeah.
And it's a really great strategy for life in general, because if you over pressurize yourself, and especially in a subject like yours, where you're constantly thinking and having to know a lot of things, going in with a strategy of, just relax, just go in it's almost like a hobby of yours,
Yeah.
That makes it easier, right? Yeah, I love
and
it.
I think that's a good point. You could generalize and say, what, everything we do, we could think of it as practice for something else.
Right.
Whichever way it goes, it's practice. I like that. That's a good motto.
I love that. Yeah. So your research on quantum chaos was actually selected for the 2011 McGraw-Hill Yearbook of Science and Technology. You also co-authored the first introductory astronomy textbook in Canada for students. Now, your research is actually focused on quantum information science. Talk to us about some of the amazing topics you research.
Quantum physics in general is just mind-blowing and amazing and confusing and just as out there as you can think. So for me, as I said, that's always exciting to explore the deep fundamental foundations of the universe, the laws of the universe. So this area broadly that I focus on research-wise is now called quantum information science. Yeah. And what that means is, how can we use the laws of quantum physics to try to improve how we process information? And what that means is things like doing better computing or secure communication, or completely new things like, teleporting information, which I know it sounds like sci-fi, but it turns out that it is possible if you can use the laws of quantum physics. And the reason I say if you can use the laws of quantum physics is because those laws are completely different, and they govern the laws that apply to particles like electrons and atoms and photons. So the microscopic world, and that world is full of interesting kinds of phenomena, like particles that have probability of being in two locations at the same time, right? Which would be very useful if we could have that kind of a power. Yeah. Turns out quantum particles do, or they can be connected to each other through space and time, in this thing called entanglement. And it doesn't matter how far away they are in the universe, they still remain connected, so that one thing, if something happens to one thing, it affects the other, which is also kind of amazing. So these very bizarre properties that we don't experience in our everyday lives actually turn out to be these superpowers that quantum particles have. and we can harness it for things like building technology. So whether it's computers or sensors or encryption networks, it turns out there's huge amounts of potential applications. And that's what was just being realized back when I was starting as a graduate student, which is why I got to be on the ground floor in this whole new area of developing this kind of quantum information technology. And now it's it's not fully mature yet, but it's getting to the point where it's more commercially being considered for, large scale rollout by companies like Google and IBM and so on. So that's been very exciting. And what you mentioned about, the McGraw-Hill kind of work, those were sort of explorations of fundamental connections between these properties like entanglement on one hand and other behaviors. And what I was working on was whether there's some kind of a chaos theory that applies to quantum particles. So, there's all these really interesting open questions that we still don't understand. But by exploring it in this approach of trying to build technology, we actually learn about the fundamental theory of quantum physics itself. So we can ask ourselves, all these weird things that we know apply, things like entanglement and these funny probabilities, that's what we call quantum, a quantum property. And if we can use those properties, then we are learning what is quantum about quantum. So to me, that's really what's interesting. Yes, building a computer is fun, but I want to know what's quantum about quantum.
Yeah, I love that. And that's actually just mind-boggling stuff. You're taking me back to my days when I did my master's and I did the odd module on quantum physics. Absolutely mind-boggling. And actually reminds me, because there's that paradox that I think a lot of people have studied about, the cat in that box with the cyanide. And in technicality, there are two realities because you can't see what's going on, and both can exist at the same time when you actually don't know. That is like, pretty much what it is, isn't it? Because you are actually having several realities existing at the same time. And that's the whole quantum nature, isn't it? So
right. And the question is it a reality at all when we say it exists? Because that's really the big, deep philosophical question. And, this famous paradox that you talked about is Schrodinger's cat's paradox, right? So Schrödinger was one of the famous physicists involved in actually developing this very bizarre theory. And it was so bizarre that actually people like Schrödinger and also Einstein, they actually really were opposed to this theory, although the mathematics was clear and it's not like they said it was wrong, but it implied all this strange potential interpretations like multiple realities and cats that can be dead and alive at the same time, that they really felt there was something wrong with the theory itself. There was something missing there. So Schrödinger came up with this bizarre experiment, right, with the cat and the poison and being dead and alive at the same time, to show that it's that strange. It can lead to this peculiar result of dead and alive cats. And it was his way of trying to prove that the theory has to be improved.
Yeah.
So it's funny now that he would probably be quite frustrated that it has become the symbol of quantum.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I love it. Who would have known? Who would have known? Yeah. So what's your view on time travel?
Oh. If only we already had a time travel device, right? There's lots of things I think I would want to go back and change about 2020, especially.
Right.
I think that my feeling, of course, is, and it's not like we can completely prove it as yet, but I think the proof that time travel is not really possible is that otherwise we'd probably have met people from the future. And as far as I know, I don't think we have. Maybe Einstein is from the future, who knows? Yeah. But I was reading a very recent article that was just published about researchers who have analyzed, this fundamental paradox of time travel, which is, what if you go back in time and, kill your own grandfather? And then would you ever be born? But if you're not born, then how could you have gone back to kill your grandfather?
Right.
So that's the paradox.
Yeah.
And so because there are paradoxes like that, people have argued that time travel can't be possible because it would lead to these impossible situations. However, the new research has shown that if you calculate it out, and if you did go back in a way that would violate cause and effect in this way, where you would be in a scenario like killing your own grandfather, turns out that you can actually find a solution always to the problem so that you avoid the paradox. That's kind of what the research is showing. So who knows, maybe there are ways, but I'll leave it to future time travelers to sort it out.
I think Stephen Hawking actually said that, didn't he? That if it was possible, it would have happened by now. But it also reminds me of Back to the Future. One of the many shows that my two young kids are watching now as well, about, asking all of these questions, and I think that's how they get interested in this in the first place, isn't it?
Yeah.
So pivoting a little bit, could you tell us about any challenges that you might have faced as being one of very few women in your field, perhaps how you overcame them, and ultimately what led you to found Laurier University's Research Center for Women in Science?
Yeah, so I would say that as a student, back when I was an undergrad student, that's when I first noticed that I was often the only woman student in the room, or one of maybe a handful. And then as I progressed through my academic career as a graduate student, I was not necessarily the one that, people would ask to be part of their homework assignment groups and things like this, right? So there are these small sorts of experiences. So you never feel like you're part of the in crowd. You're, have that feeling of being an imposter somehow, and makes you question whether you really belong and whether you have the skills, because if everybody around you is different from you, you wonder maybe they are supposed to be there and you're not, because you're missing some skills. And of course, I think as, throughout our lives, we of course have all these different stereotypes and perceptions that impact us. So, the whole, if you go to a toy store, even now, right, you'll see the girls section and the boys section. And it's not like the microscopes are usually in the girls section.
Right.
And there's no reason that they should not be in the girls section, of course. But because they are not girls, perhaps, or I'm sure I was one of those girls who, didn't necessarily think of myself as somebody who fits that image of a scientist, right? Luckily, I did have an amazing Lego set, so I built my own microscope on the Lego set, so that was great. But I think for me, progressing through science was not because, I felt completely like I belonged, but in spite of it, because I loved the science so much that I was always looking for a reason to stay. And over the years, I've also realized that when you are the only different person in the room, which is still true, right? There are very few women physicists, certainly the more senior up the ranks of academia. So anyway, I'm still one of the only few people in the room, but I've realized actually that's not necessarily a bad thing from the point of view that if people are always talking about having different perspectives and how that's powerful and you bring new ideas. By definition, of course, everything I say is different because I am different. Why is that a bad thing? Right. So, there are ways of, reframing things and being able to, build survival strategies, if you like. But I do want to point out that these are survival strategies that I shouldn't have to use. Right? I think the real problem is we need to understand and approach this problem of not having good representation in the sciences in a scientific way. Let's look at the data, see what the challenges are. Why do they exist? Are they real? Are they just made up? Turns out that the data shows that it's mostly our perception, stereotypes, environment. So if we can change that, then I don't have to use those survival techniques, and neither will the next generation of young women.
Absolutely.
So I hope that that's where we can go. And that was the thinking behind building our Center for Women in Science, to address these kinds of structural, cultural, environmental challenges by looking at the data, understanding the support structures as well as the barriers, and addressing them in some focused, meaningful way that we can then measure and assess whether it's successful or not. So that's what we do.
Very, very meaningful work. And you're right, unless you are providing your different viewpoints, nothing is going to change. And yet that's almost contradictory, because that's the work that you're in. You're there to find out things and think a way that nobody's thought about before. Right. So if anything, you should be at the center and forefront, and that's the work you're helping to do. So well done on that. Totally love that. You serve on various advisory councils and panels, and also advise academia, industry, and government on the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion in science. You're also the first person of color to be elected president of the Canadian Association of Physicists. So congratulations. Tell us about your work in diversity and inclusion. I know you've touched upon it a little bit already.
Yeah, as I said, I feel like there's been a long process of change happening slowly for sure across the board, whether it's academia or government or industry. I think there's a slow realization that, you can't ignore the fact that we are all diverse and different, right? There's not, one size that fits all. We know that. And, even science tells us that evolution progresses because of diversity.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. Let's celebrate it and use it, because it's also a powerful resource for progress. So given all of that, I feel like we can be more, strategic about how we bring these kinds of ideas and be truly inclusive in whatever is our work environment or in the classroom or wherever, right? Meaning that often we look at things like, oh, if only we can, provide a little more mentoring to the students. So there's lots of certainly mentoring programs, and that's actually great because, of course, that does help. And I'm lucky. I've also had great mentors. But as I said, the reason we need those mentors for, let's say, women or underrepresented minorities is because there's an issue with them belonging and them having a comfortable work environment where they are able to have an equal opportunity and equal voice, right? If that actually existed, then the extra mentoring would not be needed, right? So we have to move away from thinking of things like mentoring and workshops and, supports and work-life balance kinds of initiatives. We have to think of them as not the final solution, but a band-aid, right? Because that's not going to change the fact that the environment is bad. And that's why we're trying to get the women or the minorities to adapt. So it's a fix the woman kind of approach, which is a band-aid solution. So I hope that as we go forward, we work on that with this framing that, yes, we need that so that we build enough of a sort of enough numbers, for example, and enough support for those women who are part of a system that could be better. But we should also work on how to make it better. And that's why we work with advising government and industry and so on, because these are the really powerful players, right? It's about policies and workplace culture that we really have to think about to make the change, so that it's not just on all the women to adapt or be better all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because you're right. It's not just, to make change happen, it's not just in the group of physicists. You have to look holistically. Where is it coming from? What is the systemic issues going on? What are the policy changes to make the whole thing holistically possible in the first place? Amazing work there. So you've actually won multiple awards for the incredible work you are doing, including the Wilfrid Laurier University Merit Award several times for outstanding research, teaching and service. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, of course, it's always nice when, people acknowledge your work. I won't deny that. But I will say that it's the best reward would be if, you and I could talk about physics or, just about the future work that you're doing or I'm doing without having to also put it in the context of, let's say, being a woman or having to talk about barriers and challenges. That would be the ultimate reward, right? Because if that happens, then I would be able to concentrate more on the physics research, which is, of course, the real, my first love is to work on physics problems and understand the mysteries of the universe. So that's what I'm hoping we'll get to.
I love that. So before we let you go, any advice you would give to any young girls watching today, dreaming of a future in either physics or computing?
Yeah, I feel like for me, one of the mottos that I've, found very useful for my own life, it's pretty simple because, I'm not good at remembering, these big, sort of big ideas so much. So I think small. And for me, my two words are look up. And to me, what that means is, when you're feeling down, that's one way to, remember always to look up, but also to aim high. Right? So even if you don't, make it all the way to the top of the mountain, if you aim for the highest mountain, you're probably going to get to a pretty good spot and have a great view. So I feel like, looking up to me is about aiming high, about making sure you're not compromising on what's important to you and your own principles. And looking up for me in a scientific way, and this is what I would like to tell, those young girls and women or anybody who wants to think about a career in science is looking up to me is all about curiosity. So if you have ever been curious about anything about how the world works or any particular question or problem, or if you looked up at the sky and wondered about the stars, you've already taken your first steps towards being a scientist. So just keep doing that and look up, and that will keep you going, especially on those days when you will fail, because the truth is nobody has success all the time. Right. So we tell our stories, we write our biographies with all of our successes, but we don't talk about the other 5 pages of failures, which will be part of the biography. And in those 5 pages, that kind of having some way to make yourself get up and keep going is really important. For me, that's what look up means always. So when I fall down and I look down, I look up. Not to mention these days, we need to also look up from our screens. So I'll say that as a final thing.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah. As we're on a Zoom call doing this. So yeah,
right.
No, I love those. Thank you so much, Shohini, for sharing your tremendous journey with us today. Shohini Ghose, quantum physicist and professor of physics and computer science at Wilfrid Laurier University. And thank you to our viewers for watching us on this empowerment journey today. We want you to embrace that inner goddess of go-getting. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma.